Good morning to everyone joining us here in person at the Atlantic Council studios, and hello to our virtual audience tuning in from around the world. My name is Jörn Fleck, and I'm the Senior Director of the Atlantic Council's Europe Center, and today it is my pleasure to welcome you to a conversation with the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance of the Netherlands, Sigrid Kaag. Deputy Prime Minister Kaag joins us today on the final day of the Atlantic Council's all-star lineup of events for the IMF World Bank Week Series, expertly organized by our colleagues at the GeoEconomics Center as part of their Bretton Woods 2.0 project. Over the course of this week, we've heard from leading finance ministers and economic experts from all over the world about the outlook for the global and European economies. As many of our viewers following the spring meetings will know, that outlook has darkened and is characterized by heightened uncertainty, fragility, and risk. A mix of high inflation, the ongoing effects of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, financial sector turmoil, and the economic hangover of 3 years of COVID have increased the likelihood of a hard landing for the global economy. Europe has been impacted by all of these economic challenges too. Especially Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine sent shockwaves across Europe and led to a fundamental shift in Europe's understanding of its strategic dependencies, whether it's on Russia or China or otherwise. These new economic and geopolitical realities have triggered a debate in Europe on how to rethink Europe's trade, investment, fiscal, and monetary policies. European policymakers are also having to balance the challenges and opportunities of the twin digital and green transitions. The Netherlands has been a key player in debates on reducing dependencies on China for critical materials and technologies needed to advance the twin digital green transition. Having recently joined the United States and Japan with export controls on advanced semiconductor technologies. And for a country with a fourth of its territory below sea level, few understand the consequences of climate change and the need for decisive action in this area better than the Dutch. We heard back in January from Prime Minister Mark Rutte about many of these issues on his visit to the United States, and as a key member of the European Union and the Eurozone, the Netherlands have an important role to play in Europe's responses to these economic challenges and transformations. So thank you again for taking the time to join us today, Deputy Prime Minister, and we look forward to the conversation with you. For those watching virtually, make sure to keep up with the conversation by following us on Twitter at ACGeoEcon and at ACEurope. Now over to my colleague, the Senior Director of the Atlantic Council's GeoEconomics Center, Josh Lipsky, to moderate the discussion. Once again, welcome Minister Kaag, and Josh, over to you.
Jörn, thank you so much, and Deputy Prime Minister, thank you so much for being here. We know how busy this week is for you and for all the ministers, and we appreciate you taking time to come to the Atlantic Council. So I'm going to jump right in, and I'll start the way we've been starting a lot of these conversations, which is about the updated World Economic Outlook figures and the domestic economic situation in the Netherlands. The data we got this week, the forecast was 1.0 GDP growth in 2023 for the Netherlands. I think a slight upgrade from the October projection, and then 1.2 in 2024, slightly ahead of Eurozone growth overall. So does that match your expectations for the domestic economy, and how are you dealing with the rival challenge of inflation?
Yeah, no, it matches our expectations. Of course, we secretly hope that we might still do a little bit better. The president of the Dutch National Bank indicated to me that the numbers might still go up a little bit, but of course it's very modest growth. Then again, if you look at the risks we were facing last year, the shift in terms of the economic impact, the reduction of the dependency on Russian oil and gas as a response to the Russian illegal war on Ukraine. This is not bad news, but core inflation is being anchored, and that will take us longer to actually get down. And this also means that domestic expectations of continuous compensation and a sort of a safety net, that is a political issue that we obviously need to tackle.
And as you see the inflation challenge, the ECB raised rates last time, we're looking ahead to what the cycle might be, but also thinking about banking instability that we saw over the past month. How are you thinking about the tension potentially between those two? We see that coming out themes in the meetings, understanding that a range of economies, including in the US, need to get inflation under control, but not wanting to cause more stress in the financial system.
I think that's obviously a very fine line. But we anticipate and we expect, of course, that the ECB will continue at a number of sessions that they have ahead of them to raise rates.
Yeah.
It might be at a slower pace. I mean, but the ECB is formidably independent, and we like it that way. Some of our audiences in the Netherlands criticize the ECB for some of the actions taken, but we shield and we stand for their independence. At the same time, sometimes we question. What's more important, I think, that we need to focus, keep our eye on the ball of price stability. As the government, we need to make sure that we do not reinforce secondary inflationary tendencies. So the coming months, we're actually having a political debate in order to determine which targeted price support measures we can take for the most vulnerable, how we can introduce measures that are actually the most effective, but do not go for overshoot. Because we had a tentative risk last year, and ultimately we also need to look at our own compliance with basically the fiscal rules of Europe.
Well, I wanted to get to the fiscal rules. I'm glad you brought it up because there's been talk about Stability and Growth Pact and when the suspension of the rules might be lifted. I think we heard from the Commission maybe 2024. Does that align with your expectations? And would you agree with the lifting of the rules in 2024 or lifting of the suspension?
Well, we definitely need to get out of this. And we've said this before in the ECOFIN meetings. It's not sustainable. It's an unhealthy message, not only to our own societies, but also to markets. Otherwise we risk entering a twilight zone. And if we want to be a geopolitical union, where we are strong on the political, external foreign policy and defense decisions that we take within NATO, but externally, we also have to get our act together financially, because the underpinnings of what we are as an internal market, that's our beacon, needs to be strong. So our call to the Union and to the Commission has been, please put forward the proposal on the reform of the Stability and Growth Pact, and let's start the negotiations. Nobody will be happy.
Of course.
But ultimately, let's see where we can find conversions on an effective Stability and Growth Pact, and above all, something that we all should align and comply with.
So it could look different than it did before, is essentially.
It ought to look different, because actually, if you look at the reality, it was a very complex system, almost a forest where one could get lost and not see the trees, and the exemptions were quite predominant in the system. So everybody had its own way out, but it didn't help when you look at debt reduction, reforms, or the space for investments, and we obviously need to get there.
And the pushback, I think, would be if we do this right when economies are recovering, Eurozone growth at 0.8, some economies going slower, some faster within the Eurozone, we could hamper the recovery just as it's getting started in 2024. What would you say to that?
Yeah, I think it's too early to say, because first of all, I haven't seen the proposal on the table. Last year with Spain, the Netherlands sort of took the bold move together to present what was an outline of some of our thinking, i.e. we're in favor of national debt reduction pathways. We need to be stringent on the safeguards. We're looking at the use of the DSA as a system, but we also require transparency and, of course, I don't like to call it compliance because it sounds too harsh, but oversight, and then, of course, alignment and sanctions if a country chooses willfully, without evidence, without actually reason to not comply with and not follow the path. And I think this is where the tension lies in the discussions. How far can you go? And which metrics do you use? Sort of the common numerical benchmark, is that useful? So we ensure also equity in the decisions.
I think that's very helpful to understand that going forward, if this is 2024, whenever it be, it needs to look different, be reformed, reorganized, but to start the process of having that conversation right
with
now.
any negotiations, you've got to start somewhere. You'll never get your perfect model. You never get your wish either, generally. But let's see what is the best game in town. And I think we owe that to our citizens. And it's also a sign of an effective union.
Yes. So speaking of EU spending, I wanted to talk about Next Gen EU and the spending that's happened under that. There was a lot of controversy when it was approved. Now, 2 years on, what's your assessment of the program?
Well, we have two programs perhaps. The start was, of course, the Corona Recovery Fund. The Dutch were very stringent in terms of the conditionality. And I have to be honest, sort of in a Dutch way in this case, we were the last to submit our own plan because we were slow in forming a government. And then some of our colleagues, of course, were not necessarily pleased with the fact that the conditions were quite harsh. But I've been saying, you got what you wish for. What we ask of others, the least we can do is also ensure we live with this ourselves and we deliver. So I think the recovery fund is working well. Countries such as Spain is making progress. The Commission is very stringent in terms of its reviews and to see if the money is well spent, as it ought to, in line with the agreements. Next Gen EU is the next level over that, and it really focuses on greening the economy and harnessing the digitalization of Europe. And I think that's super effective. The only difference between ourselves and some other countries is that we're not willing necessarily to say, okay, a new program, additionality of funding. There, our position is much more reserved and reticent. We feel there is sufficient money out there. Let's use it, and first use what we have and get the results that we need.
Well, I think then you might be really perfectly placed to answer a conversation we've been having throughout the meetings, which is how you balance the need for green transition, as you talked about, digital transition, but also in a high inflationary environment. And you talked to needing within the Netherlands economy to get spending in a good place. We talked about stability and growth back. There seems to be some tension of all the spending we feel like we need to do to facilitate these important societal changes that we know will help economies grow in the medium term, but dealing with the very specific near-term challenges of inflation.
Yeah, it's a tough one because we're facing it, and I'll use our own domestic example, our current situation, and I can probably project it to Europe. We have set aside at a government level a lot of subsidies in order to tackle climate change and also deal with what we call is a nitrogen crisis in the country. It's very specific to the Netherlands, not unique, but quite specific. The subsidy side is there. The norming and pricing aspect in order to regulate also demand and force customers and companies to make choices with a view towards the future is sort of slow to catch on. It's obviously not necessarily the most popular feature of any such program. And so I think at a European level as well, we've got to be very careful that we not only throw money at the problem, but we really encourage choices, because this is all part of a transition, consuming differently, producing differently, and ensuring that there are trade-offs, because we are all at a risk of fueling inflation inadvertently in the short term, whilst we're trying to spend our way into a new future.
Exactly.
And I think that's a balancing act. And I do not have the perfect answer for that, as you can tell. But I know in the Netherlands we are grappling with this issue right now. And you see the same at Europe. The tendency to only resolve any huge challenge or transnational challenge, such as climate change or the need to reform the economy, cannot only be done by throwing money at the problem, simply put.
And is that a message that's accepted amongst other finance ministers? I'm talking outside the EU now. You're co-chair of the Committee of Finance Ministers, the coalition on climate change. So wondering what conversations you've been having on that front.
Well, I try not to use the European example too much because the coalition is definitely, I'm co-chairing it with Sri Mulyani, the Minister of Finance of Indonesia. It's a global coalition. And I think in Europe we have the luxury of having the fiscal space to rally around the issues and also to support citizens and companies to make the transition. But at the same time, all ministers of finance are centrally placed to look in their toolbox, from pricing, carbon pricing, to finance, the phasing out of fossil industries, the subsidies, the fiscal space that you can use. So it's a central role that needs to be played. And this is why we opted to co-chair this coalition, use the toolbox, use the instruments, but also have the conversation with the IMF and the World Bank to ensure that the international backing is out there. And from a finance ministry perspective, in a DAC country, OECD DAC country, I also like to see that my colleague, the Minister for Aid, spends the money in the most effective way.
That's a very important point. We had folks from USAID here now, and the relationship between Treasury and USAID. This is an issue across governments.
Actually, it's a very old-fashioned way in the past to sort of determine that finance is domestic and a little bit international, sort of the Bretton Woods 1.0. And actually, Bretton Woods 2.0 is really thinking and acting globally and leveraging the assets, be it knowledge, access to markets, new financing, leveraging the private sector. I think that's the way we need to work and assist one another.
We can't be siloed in the thinking and the money flows every different direction.
We never should have, but we need to get out of this.
That's right. We always say here at the GeoEconomics Center, GeoEconomics is not a new idea, it's just an old idea we forgot in the West.
It's interesting, no?
If we think of the Bretton Woods system.
Same as geopolitics.
Yes.
I mean, we've been confronted with this through the Russian illegal war on Ukraine. We talk a lot of geopolitics now, but actually geopolitics has been around forever. We just made different choices and had different assumptions about peace and security.
So I will get to geopolitics and geoeconomics and the IMF in a moment and the reason you're in Washington this week. But one more question on the Eurozone, the ECB's digital euro project.
Yeah.
We've been asking Eurozone finance ministers who are here their perspective on it, what they think the timeline is, and how it would affect your domestic economy.
Yes. Well, how it affects our domestic economy is too early to tell. The Netherlands is a country where cash is actually poorly used, I would say. We've gone in 10 years from a user base of 60% to now only 20%. So it's sort of being phased out by the absence of use, but it should remain available. We're also a country that likes to innovate and likes to use technological applications in more than one way. But the discussion on the digital euro is a very sensitive one. It will be broad-based, and the Netherlands, together with a few of the big players, Spain, France, Italy, and Germany, has issued an early statement. We've rallied the Commission to say, around a set of stringent conditionalities, we can consider the introduction of a digital euro. But the political conversation needs to be had, and in our case, same as in other countries, it will be passing through Parliament. We need full political approval before we can actually agree to the introduction. And we're not at that phase yet. Yeah. We haven't seen the design yet. Right. We've issued a declaration on which there is agreement around issues of privacy, the programmability or the lack thereof, and the types of controls that are needed to safeguard privacy and other important matters. But I'm very keen to see which proposal will be put on the table. I know the ECB is very careful and cautious with the design considerations, but I need to see it. I can't leapfrog into this discussion without having debated it fully with Parliament.
Fair enough. It's a sensitive issue here as well, as it is in Europe, but I do think Europe's ahead of the United States in this area and has a chance to be a standard setter in the area. So we all look eagerly to see what the ECB...
A lot of other countries are moving ahead if you look at India and others.
Yes,
so India, it's an important issue to table.
Yeah, and we've tracked this very closely at the Atlantic Council. We have our CBDC tracker. So for anyone watching online, you can explore, look at China and India and the range of over 100 countries now in CBDC exploration.
I didn't realize that.
So it's rapidly developed. But I think when the ECB, if they do go forward with it because of the power of the market and the standard and the privacy settings they would have associated with it, would be a game changer. Yeah. So I want to talk about Ukraine for a moment. I think Netherlands so far has promised and committed about 2.5 billion euros in aid to Ukraine. Of course, the IMF has packaged, just approved 15 billion, a program that will come out over several years. I know you've had discussions with your counterparts in Ukraine. What more do you think the Netherlands can or should be doing for Ukraine, and then the EU as a whole?
We need to continue what we're doing at three levels. First of all, the unequivocal political support. That means both condemnations of Russia's actions, that means support for the design of additional sanctions and packages that work. That means also continued support when it comes to discussions in future around bringing Ukraine into the European Union. In the reality of the now, humanitarian support and of course the military support, and ensuring that within NATO we stand as one and that we also do our bit. At a national level, we want to actually make the 2% NATO contribution, which we should have done a long time ago. But for Ukraine itself, we will rally continuously, as we're also in the same constituency in the World Bank and IMF. We will rally that they get the liquidity support in time, that they get the funding for the reconstruction needs as they evolve. And of course, we need to be there where it matters, and that is now and in future. The expression to do whatever it takes, I think, could easily become a much repeated phrase, but we mean it. We have to walk the talk.
And of course, a European expression, do whatever it takes, from Mario Draghi,
from Mario Draghi,
we all have adopted. I think we adopted it during the SVB situation here a few months ago, and that was you apply.
We just have to make sure it doesn't become a hollow phrase.
Yes, well said. So I want to broaden out a little to the IMF meetings and the reason you're here. And maybe starting with what we have sort of said is the theme of the week, this word fragmentation, which means different things to different people depending on when you hear it. But at least as I think the IMF intended it, and they launched research here last week on it, was really focused on the US and China, not just trade tensions, but a range of geopolitical tensions and how that impacts the rest of the global economy. They had modeled in one scenario potential 2% drawdown in global GDP if countries were forced to come into blocks. And I'm just wondering, from your perspective, do you think this theme has been misinterpreted or overtaken the meetings a little bit?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure. It's certainly, it's around. It was around in the conversation the last IMF World Bank meetings too.
Yeah.
If you look at it geopolitically, fragmentation has always been an issue. It was either two blocks or a multipolar world. I'm not quite sure if this changes much in the reality of people, but it changes, I think, the perspective around which policymakers or politicians need to act. Fragmentation from a European perspective could mean, yes, we fragment the world because we're applying sanctions to the Russians and all those who assist.
Yeah.
So, but we take that as a given and as a must. When it comes to dealing with the impact of the war in Ukraine, the Russian war on Ukraine, on the global south, I think we just talked about this. If you're in the global south and you're highly indebted, the word fragmentation doesn't mean very much to you because you want to trade, you want a globalized world that works for you, that you have access to markets, and that actually your citizens also have access to the vaccines and to the supplies that they require, and you need to work your way out of debt. Yes. So I think it's sort of sometimes an overly theoretical concept, important for us, but in the lives of people less so. And so I'm a little bit more taken by the comment Ngozi made of the WTO. Yeah, we need to act, but if we talk about deglobalization, end of globalization, or reshoring, etc., and fragmentation, I think, is in the same realm of the conversation, let's look at reglobalization. That is inclusive, that is truly a free and fair trade, but with benefits that do not harness further inequality and inequity, because that's also been an unintended outcome of the growth of globalization. All trade has not brought the same benefits to all people. So I think that conversation needs to be had.
And you mentioned debt, and I want to talk about that because it seems this is one of the sort of key test moments of these meetings. Can we get a breakthrough on debt restructuring, debt renegotiations, debt relief for countries that need it? I'm thinking of Zambia in particular, but not only Zambia. We're now 2 years into the common framework. We still don't have a breakthrough. China has been recalcitrant on this. Do you see any progress being made in your conversations? Do you expect any progress or any breakthroughs?
I'm hopeful that there will be progress because I think it's ultimately very necessary. I think the levels of indebtedness are truly destabilizing to many countries. If you can consider it as triggers of potential domestic conflict, it lies in the levels of indebtedness to countries and the absence of any prospects. So we need to act. I haven't heard yet of confirmation that there's really been a game changer when it comes to China playing its role at the table. There are sightings and sounds, I would say. But like with anything, people could say that about us too. Seeing is believing. Let's have a focused conversation. What we also believe is that there should be greater access to middle-income countries. And so far, we've always focused on the low-income countries with right and reason. But middle-income countries are suffering in a growing scale of high levels of indebtedness, which are truly destabilizing. So from there, again, you also need to link geoeconomics to geopolitics. You just cannot separate them.
No, I'm really glad you raised middle-income countries because it doesn't get nearly enough attention in the conversations. We focus on a few specific low-income countries and look only at that. But if we know if this happens, it can happen in waves, and then suddenly we'd be behind the curve on it very quickly. I want to broaden out on China since we're talking about China. We just had President Macron visit, President von der Leyen visit. There's an interesting sort of a difference of their takeaways and treatment of the trip and then their sort of perspectives on the trip on the way back. But just wondering from your perspective and the Dutch perspective, how you see, what President von der Leyen called for, the de-risking. I mean, what does that mean from a Dutch perspective? There are deep economic linkages with China, just like there are here in the United States. How do you approach that right now? And not thinking of semiconductors particularly, I know that's not your purview, but more broader for the China economic relationship.
Well, we've always, the Netherlands, and I think that's also the EU position, also espoused by France, we consider China both, there's a prospect of partnership, there is an element of potential risk, and there is potential system rivalry. And I think through that lens, President von der Leyen has really is tackling the issue of de-risking. That means reducing our dependencies. We've seen that in Corona. We need to do that regardless. We need to sort of securing our critical infrastructure. We have investment screenings, an instrument that we hadn't had. We've introduced this a few years ago. So all of these elements are important to bolster Europe's position, but from a perspective of being a more forceful and more credible ally, I would say. So it's not an either or, but it's within alliances, within the Union and within NATO to make sure that we actually are effective. And reducing our dependencies, I think, is a healthy one. There is the critical Raw Materials
Yeah,
Act. There's the Net Zero Industrial Act. So there are a number of instruments that we probably should have taken on board anyways, but now we're accelerating that position, given the world we live in, and it's a healthy sign. But when it comes to the Netherlands, we've always espoused an open strategic autonomy as a nation that has sort of benefited and wants to continue to benefit from global trade, but in a manner that is smart, without being reduced to a protectionist tendency.
Yeah. That's the balance. That's the tricky balance so many countries are trying to find right now, and not getting on the wrong side of it.
Getting it done, but that's
and it will come to fruition in just situations specific of this product, this company, as we address them.
Correct.
So we only have about 5 minutes left. I want to turn to some questions that we have coming in online. You mentioned sanctions. We talked about the euro. What do you make of this move? And this actually builds on some of the comments actually President Macron made about the relationship between the dollar and the euro and the drive for some countries to try to diversify away from the dollar and the euro, reduce reliance on the dollar and the euro. Do you think sanctions over the past year has accelerated the interest for some countries to do that?
Potentially. It depends very much which part of the world you're in. I know we've also heard President Lula now, from his old, I think, political convictions also speak to that. And I think that's part of the way certain big international players want to position themselves. But for the Netherlands, we very much spend our time and effort in order to make sure that the euro is stable, that we do what's necessary to ensure the eurozone stability. We have our own risk factors within, and for that, again, we need the reform of the Stability and Growth Pact. But to spend our time on a move away from the dollar, I think is neither fruitful nor the issue in hand. The dollar is the global trading currency. We should do our bit to make the euro also effective.
And the dollar and the euro worked in tandem over the past year to great impact.
Absolutely, absolutely. Right. And I think it also then speaks to the political choices that you have. So from our perspective, it's necessary that to make sure we strengthen that, as opposed to engage in potential efforts that actually take away from our assets.
Thank you for that. I'll take one more from the floor here, and it's about reform of the IMF and the World Bank, which is something we think about a lot. As we run a Bretton Woods 2.0 project, and we're hosting finance ministers all week. There's what the IMF needs to do with this: meetings, there's debt restructuring, there's liquidity, there's support for Ukraine, which we talked about. But going forward, big picture, 77 years of the IMF and the World Bank, of the Bretton Woods institutions, what is the big picture reforms that you think are needed from your perspective? Basically, the question I think we have here, and I'll sort of reinterpret it, is, are they still fit for purpose?
I think it's a perennial question you can ask of many of the international institutions. We have to acknowledge both the UN, Security Council, the Bretton Woods institutions. They're all a product of post-World War II era, and they're reflective of the power balance of that era. There are so many new players. Wealth is distributed differently. Countries have gained in status. So a reform, I think, is always important, but I'm not one, and maybe that's because I spent a lot of my time also discussing reform debates. I'm now more of the tendency to look ahead, build a vision, but at the same time see pragmatically in a world of great uncertainty what can be done to render the institutions we have fitter for purpose.
Yes.
The big epitaph to say fit for purpose is always aspirational. You're never as fit for purpose as, so to speak, the last assignment that you have or the last challenge that you tackled. So for the IMF and the bank in particular, I want them to be much more risk embracing. We think that they do not risk their AAA rating by engaging further, being more forward leaning, looking at taking a quick and grand look at the instruments that they have, and we need to adopt a different posture. I think particularly as OECD countries, we need to engage that conversation differently. But I can't think of system reform without also thinking of the UN that needs to be fitter for purpose, because they're often inhabiting parallel worlds, and the money sits here, but the normative and the aspirational aspects are within the UN. And I think we need to align them more critically. This is where the Mia Motley initiative, so to speak, I think is a very powerful one, and I'm very pleased to also be joining that conversation and partaking in that at the conference in Paris. Let's hope we can actually come up with an action agenda where we deliver, because it's all about delivery and making the change.
That's where the credibility comes from. It's about delivering.
Yeah.
And we hope that's what is achieved both at this IMF World Bank meetings and going forward on the road to Marrakesh. Deputy Prime Minister, thank you for being with us this morning at the Atlantic Council. Thank you everyone for joining and watching around the world. We are hosting the Polish Finance Minister in 2 hours from now, so stay tuned. And we look forward to that conversation. That will be our final event of IMF World Bank Week at the Atlantic Council. I want to thank everyone for their participation, for their comments, for their questions. We hope you stay with the Atlantic Council throughout our programming, both today, next week, and on the road to the annual meetings in Marrakesh. Have a good rest of the day.